Hello, and welcome to Middle East Focus, a weekly podcast on regional affairs and U.S. policy, produced by the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. I'm Alistair Taylor, MEI's editor-in-chief.
And I'm Matthew Czekaj, managing editor at MEI.
Tensions between the U.S. and Iran continue to mount amid the largest U.S. military buildup in the Middle East in decades. Negotiators are set to meet later this week for a third round of talks on a diplomatic solution to Iran's nuclear program, but serious divisions remain. Should the talks fail, President Donald Trump is reportedly weighing options for military action. All this comes as Tehran faces renewed anti-government demonstrations, just weeks after the Iranian security apparatus brutally cracked down on large-scale protests across the country, killing thousands. How is the regime preparing for what comes next? What is the state of the Iranian opposition? And if war does break out, what impact might that have on Iran's internal dynamics? To discuss all of these issues and more, we're pleased to once again be joined by one of MEI's leading experts on Iran, Senior Fellow Alex Vatanka. Alex focuses on Iranian and broader Middle Eastern security affairs. He's the author of several books, including, most recently, The Battle of the Ayatollahs in Iran, The United States, Foreign Policy and Political Rivalry Since 1979. He's currently working on his next book, which focuses on Iran's strategy towards the Arab world.
Our listeners can subscribe to Middle East Focus on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other podcast providers. And please check out MEI's other podcasts, Rethinking Democracy, hosted by Gunil Toll, and Taking the Edge Off the Middle East with Brian Katulis.
Alex, welcome back to the program. It's great to have you once again on Middle East Focus.
Alistair, Matt, it's wonderful to be back. I very much look forward to our conversation.
So, Alex, before we dive in, I just want to timestamp things for our listeners to make it clear. We are recording this episode on the afternoon of February 24th. Things may have changed by the time this episode is released. Now that I've given that caveat, let's dive right in. Alex, with the threat of war seemingly looming ever greater, how is Iran preparing?
Well, listen, on the one part, what they're doing is continuing on the diplomatic track. So, Alistair, just a few hours ago, I was reading statements from the foreign ministry in Tehran. Anything is possible when it comes to prospects of diplomacy. Iran is apparently willing to do anything. That's at least what they're saying. Obviously, you would question the timing of this. Why wait this long? If anything is possible, why not have said this earlier? So I think it's, for the Iranian side to at least let everyone around the world know that Iran is not the one that wants this war. But at the same time, as they are promising diplomacy still might have a chance, as we all know and we've seen, as the United States has ratcheted up its military, flexed its muscle, if you will, militarily in the region, brought assets in, the Iranian side has tried to echo that in terms of its promise of being ready to defend. So we've seen an increasing amount of rhetoric that I hadn't really seen to this extent in prior rounds of conflict, which I think is a reflection of the fear that exists in Tehran about how big this war could potentially be. So what you hear from the Iranian side is, and I have to say, this was basically said first and foremost by the system's top leader, Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, who said, let me say it very explicitly to the Americans, if there will be another war between U.S. and Iran, this time it'll be a regional war. Now, you can take that at face value and just dismiss it as some, bluff from Tehran. But I really think if they feel that this is going to be a fight for their survival, not just political survival, in many cases it will be a question of, individuals in this regime being able to come out of this alive, they have everything to lose. So I think what they are going to do is to try and, if it's going to be a fight for survival, try and hurt as many as they can, not just the United States, but other actors in the region, including Israel and presumably the Gulf countries, and sort of not go down quietly, if you will. But look, we are speaking 2 days before the next promised round of talks. I don't know what's going to happen between now and then. But there is this chance that one side decides to blink, if you will. Or maybe even a better scenario is that they blink simultaneously, because both sides have a lot to lose in a war that can be started, uh, but its outcome is very difficult to predict in terms of what it means for the region. We know Iran's going to lose militarily in a military conflict. That's almost foregone conclusion. The question is, how much damage can Iran do in the process before it waves the white flag or loses?
So, Alex, let's drill down into some of the details here. And I specifically wanted to start by looking at the Iranian opposition, the society itself. One of the things we've seen over the past week is a renewed rise of anti-government protests in Iran, specifically by students. What is driving these students to go out into the streets again? I mean, what is the mindset given what they faced a month ago with the incredibly brutal government crackdown on protests then?
Matt, I don't know if I would have dared do what these students are doing in the streets of Tehran. I mean, the amount of bravery that it takes to go out and chant death to the dictator when you literally are standing next to armed security forces who will have the power to pick you up and you can disappear. And these young people in their early 20s, some of them teenagers, standing and saying death to the dictator in downtown Tehran. I mean, there are over 2 dozen of universities, and many of these universities have experienced protests in recent days. And as you pointed out, Matt, this is just a few weeks after the regime killed, at the very least, over 7,000 protesters. So, why would people risk so much? And I think the answer to that is because they've just had enough. 47 years of a regime that is, absolutely refusing to listen to its own people when it comes to basic policies and where it's taking the country both at home and abroad. And this is not going to go away. And let me link this up to what we were discussing just earlier with Alistair in terms of the buildup and potential war between U.S. and Iran. Here's the basic reality facing the Islamic Republic. Yes, it has dealt with the United States pressure, even war before, but it's never dealt with a situation where it's confronting two extremely important fronts. One is the domestic front, again, protesters, and this is not limited to protesters. We're talking a majority of Iranian population just simply want to get over the Islamic Republic and get on with their lives. The question is, what would be the day after this system? And that's a whole separate issue which might turn to maybe when we're talking about the opposition in broader terms. On the other hand, we have, obviously the United States military buildup. The regime has never been tested in that sense. And, we hear the rhetoric, they're ready to defend. And I'm not going to question Iran's capacity to do some serious damage if war breaks out. But they've never been tested where they had to fight a formidable adversary coming from outside, in this case, United States, probably Israel too, and this extremely upset Iranian population, this demographic that's refusing to go away. They are asking for fundamental change. And let me tell you something that hasn't changed, and that is the attitude of the Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei from the top. He is continuing to refuse to listen to his own people. He continues to call them names, foreign agents, and you name it. So I don't know. It's a very dangerous situation. And the part that really almost makes it even scarier in many ways is this 86-year-old Supreme Leader seems to be ready for death. And he doesn't care, it seems, when I listen to his speeches, how many innocent people, I should add, die along with him in a war that can really be prevented. Because let's go back to what this is all about. Enrichment of uranium, which can be suspended or stopped forever in Iran, and few Iranians will miss it. And the question of what Iran is doing in the region, which again has been brought nothing but sanctions and misery for the Iranian nation, as opposed to anything that benefits the national interest. So we have an ideological entity in the Islamic Republic that's dragged the country of Iran to this point, and they're fighting two big fronts, domestic front and the foreign front. And again, as I said, untested, uncharted territory, I should say. And we have to be seeing if this war breaks out, how long, because I'm not sure if the regime will last, but the question is how long it will last. It probably will fall if it comes to that.
So, Alex, thanks for that. We definitely want to come back to many of these issues that we just raised. But before we do, I do want to stay on this question of the opposition just a little bit longer. One thing we've seen here, again, is protesters waving flags of the monarchy. They're chanting slogans around Pahlavi, the son of the former Shah. And it does raise some very important questions about the Iranian opposition itself. It's a topic that you actually focused on in a recent piece in Foreign Affairs that you co-authored with Sanam Vakil of Chatham House. And I want to quote something to you. You described the Iranian opposition as, quote, an archipelago of political islands divided by geography, generation, ideology, and exposure to repression. Just kind of pointing out how, it's made up of these very disparate groups, some of which, don't have much to do with each other than basically a hatred of the regime or just, wanting to see things change in Iran. But in the series of recent rounds of protests that we've seen in Iran, which, as you've pointed out many times, have been getting more and more frequent, do we also see kind of this increasing tendency for, some of these very disparate groups to come together? Is this a trend that you think will hold, and what can we expect?
So, Matt, the trend is absolutely clear. It's there. The monarchists are having much more sway, if you will, and they're out there, the loudest, oftentimes, certainly in the diaspora, but also inside of Iran. We're hearing the name of Reza Pahlavi being chanted inside of Iran in ways we hadn't seen before. So that trend is for sure a reality. Will it stay? Will it get stronger, weaker? Obviously, so much will depend on how the monarchist, if you will, and I shouldn't say monarchist because not everybody who wants Reza Pahlavi to be the leader is calling for him to be the next king or return to where his father left off. Many are looking to him as the transition leader, which is fundamentally different than asking him to be the king. Look, Reza Pahlavi has name recognition, is an inspirational leader for many. But as we pointed out in that article in Foreign Affairs, many are not sure if he's got what it takes in terms of his organizational skill set to keep this opposition together, to get it ready to take over should the Islamic Republic fall within Iran. Somebody has to take over. Who would be that leader? Could he play that kind of a role? These are question marks. Look, when I go on social media, Persian language, discussions that are happening, one of the things that hits you right away, so much of the fighting, it's not between the opposition and the Islamic Republic, it's actually among the oppositionists, calling each other names. And this is something we've gotten to see for about half a century. As long as the Islamic Republic's been around, the opposition has been, basically fighting itself. And that's that. We had hoped that at this point we would have moved on, that the political opposition has matured sufficiently that you can talk about it, them being able to at least agree on their basic demands in terms of what they want to see happen in Iran. And to some extent, we've seen some progress, but certainly not enough. So there's a lot of work to be done there. And if the United States is serious about regime change, and that could become something that once this war breaks out, if it breaks out, and there's a phase two, that phase two most likely looks like political transformation of the system. And that means United States needs to start looking at the various Iranian groups and who can I work with, who can I empower to take over there in terms of the central government of Tehran, because the alternative is anarchy in a country of 90 million people, and nobody wants that. So the opposition really should act much better, much faster to prove that they can be a serious contender, as you said, Matt, not just being against the Islamic Republic, but be for something very different and prove that they can be organized enough to credibly prove to the many who are on the fence that they are the ones who can do it.
Alex, one of the major constraints that seems to come up is that, as you said, people can't, in the diaspora, in the opposition camp, don't seem to be able to overcome those ideological lines. How do you address that? And I want to drill down specifically on one aspect, which is this issue around minority groups in Iran, the Kurds, the Baluchs, the Arabs, the Azerbaijanis, who make up more than a third of the population. They're very wary historically of Persian majority domination. How are opposition groups trying to kind of address that issue, and that as a sort of subset of the broader issue of bringing together these different camps?
The way I look at it, Alistair, is the minority question is a real one. It's not made up. And I know a lot of people in the Persian community, particularly in diaspora, they kind of refuse to accept that. And they call these, whether it's ethnic Kurds or Baluch or Ahwazi Arabs, call them names, separatists and so on. This is hardly a solution. Ethnic minorities in Iran are reality. By some accounts, over about half of Iran's population are not Persians, if you will. They're minorities. So they have a real stake in terms of what comes the day after. The issues that minorities have had with the central government in Tehran are not just linked to the Islamic Republic. They go back before. The Shah also had issues and so forth. This is an imperial state. This is a country that's been around as a one country, nation, if you will, nation state, I should say, about over 5,000 years. So, of course, it's got all sorts of differences inside of it. But it's also a strength that these people have lived and coexisted together for so long. So, for example, the supreme leader of Iran is half Azeri. The man who many want him to replace the central government as the leader, Reza Pahlavi, is half Azeri. The president, Masoud Pezeshkian, is Azeri Kurdish. So this is also an important factor because it sometimes becomes almost like a cartoon image that the Persians are dominating everybody else. This is hardly the case. If you actually want to see one domination of one group over others, it's not so much the ethnic factor, it's the sectarian factor. The Shia Muslims in Islamic Republic dominate the state because that's basically what the constitution empowers them to do. The supreme leader has to be a Shia. The president has to be a Shia. Pretty much anybody of in a position of power has to be Shia. So that's another way of looking at it. And I would say, if I was advising various opposition groups, including the ethnic groups, I would say, listen, you pick the timing of when you want to have this conversation about what kind of a system you want in Iran after the Islamic Republic is gone, with a strong central government, more of a federalist system. Because as long as you're bickering among yourselves now, while the Islamic Republic is still in power, guess who benefits? It's not you, it's the Islamic Republic, who, by the way, has always argued these ethnic minorities are nothing but pawns in the hands of foreign powers who have one ultimate mission, which is the dismantlement of Iran as a single country, if you will. And they want to turn Iran into a Yugoslavia of the 1990s, where the ethnic groups go on, kill one another in a state of civil war. So you want to prove them wrong. That's why you have to recognize ethnic minorities, a reality of Iranian society. They have serious demands. Many of them are legitimate demands in terms of language rights and so forth, religious freedoms that don't exist for many, including Jews and Christians. But that doesn't mean you go out and start fighting one another now when you still have to focus on the big common enemy, which is the dictatorship of the Islamic Republic for the last 47 years.
Alex, speaking of that last point, the dictatorship of the Islamic Republic, dissent or fissures among regime insiders and a sort of unwillingness on the part of security forces to fire on their own people are often seen as kind of key hurdles to clear for a real challenge to the regime. Are we seeing any movement on that front? Is there anything notable there in your view as you kind of closely analyze what's going on in the country?
It's always a big factor to watch out for because Ali Khamenei is not out there in the streets killing protesters himself. He needs people to do that for him. And if those people refuse to do it, well, then Ali Khamenei is in a very different position in terms of ability to stay in power. We haven't seen, major defections. I haven't seen any, in fact, of members of the armed forces who have come out and said, we're taking the uniforms off. Well, we have seen some reports, mostly anecdotal, but that's pretty given that Iran is the society it is in terms of freedom of expression and so on. People expressing real doubt about what they've been asked to do, killing young Iranians for this regime to stay in power. Let me just give you a demographic reality that I think makes this case. Of the people that were killed over the course of 2 days in January, just over a month ago, most of those killed were in the 15 to 25 demographic, right? If you're the members of the security forces in the Islamic Republic today, you're most likely out there killing young Iranian youth that you, in your wicked mind, might represent as killing Mossad agents. But nobody buys that. I'm not saying Israel, United States, others aren't involved one way or another in being interested in the outcome of these protesters. But the idea that everybody is sort of getting a phone call from Mossad and they come out to the streets is nonsense. And I think that is exactly why so many, presumably in the security forces, are having a bad taste in their mouths when they have to kill Iranian youth. When will they say enough is enough? When will they stop? I mean, if this becomes the trend, that every few weeks or months you have to go out there, machine gun down, is exactly what they're doing. Machine gunning down fellow citizens, maybe children of people they know. Because a lot of these killings are happening in small towns where those killed and those doing the killing actually know one another. This creates a situation we haven't seen before. Politics used to be political mobilization, used to be something you saw in the major cities like Tehran and so on. Now it's so personal. It's happening in small towns out in the west in Kermanshah, Hamadan province, where everyone knows what's going on. And it creates a really explosive situation. But look, fundamentally what is at stake here is defections from the Islamic Republic is something that the opposition needs to focus on, because if people, those without blood on their hands, if they decide they don't want to have anything to do with this is a sinking ship, they want to leave it, guess what? That's the best way forward for a transition from Islamic Republic to something else with minimum, hopefully, bloodshed. Because if it doesn't happen and these people who are defending the regime today decide to do so to the very end, some of them will invariably do so, but many of them might decide not to. That just, again, reduces the likelihood of bloodshed.
Alex, if we do see, given the dynamics that you're describing here, if we do see an attack by an outside force, the U.S. and Israel, perhaps, would that, in this context, do you think provide a useful catalyst for opposition groups to kind of unite against an embattled, vulnerable regime, or would it have more of a kind of classic rally around the flag effect and shore up support for the regime? How do you see that factor playing in here?
So there are many different scenarios one could point to based on what the evidence we see when we hear people's views and expressions. But I think that the rallying around the flag would be the least of the likely outcomes. Because what does that mean, rallying around the flag? The flag of who? The flag of the Islamic Republic? Because that's the flag the protesters are burning today. That's the flag that they feel ashamed of. They don't feel that flag represents who they are as Iranians or what they want as Iranians. So that's the fundamental issue that the regime has to deal with. It cannot go out and say, come to the rallying around the flag when I just killed 7,000 people who just basically asking for political change. But it still doesn't necessarily mean if there's a foreign intervention, everybody's going to rush to the side of the United States. That, again, one of those untested theories. It might do. We are certainly hearing from inside of Iran many, 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 and more so in the diaspora, who are saying we cannot bring this regime down on our own. We need a helping hand. And I've seen Iranians sort of make comparisons even to the United States and the Revolutionary War in this country, saying the French helped the American revolutionaries. Who's going to help the Iranian revolutionaries today against Ali Khamenei and Islamist rule? So look, I don't think anybody in Iran serious. Alistair and Matt, this takes us to one of those really great unknowns that troubles many. Let's say there is a set of American airstrikes on the nuclear facilities, missiles, and so on. Fine. But that has no bearing really on the well-being or the strength of the opposition. Let's just say the United States decides to take it a step further and starts hitting, say, Revolutionary Guards headquarters and bases and the besieged militias and so on. Now you're starting to see something happen here, but at a great risk in the sense that you might also, instead of having people defect, as I was discussing earlier, you might, which I think is unlikely, but it's a scenario to keep in mind, create a reason for people who are inside the regime to actually fight for not the regime's survival so much as opposed to their own survival. Which takes me to an argument I wanted to make. What is the strategy in the part of the United States, the Iranian opposition in diaspora, to provide an off-ramp for members of the regime so they have a future after the regime collapses? That really is missing. That really right now is missing. There's a lot of sort of generic talk about secular democracy in Iran, but it's not just going to miraculously happen. There needs to be a pathway. People need to be convinced that there is actually a likelihood that this could happen. And unless they kill people, they might have a way to not be, fearing a future after the Islamic Republic. So I see that the duality there. Those who are saying, help us, we're dying here, they're killing us in their thousands. And those who were saying, yeah, but wouldn't we Iranians be better off have this in our own hands? Because whoever comes because a foreign intervention will always suffer from having political legitimacy. Now, I tend to think at this point, Islamic Republic has upset so many, killed so many, burned so many bridges that frankly, I think if you average Iranian, and I'm obviously speculating here, they would take their chances and say, if the United States can do an effective job, get rid of the Islamic Republic, we'll just figure out what comes next. That isn't good enough for many, not everybody though. There are those who are saying we're not going to replace one theocracy with another kind of dictatorship, which they fear might happen because they have the example of 1979. 1979 revolution was about democracy. They ended up with a theocracy. So a lot of moving parts to this conversation. And as you can hear me describe it to you, a lot of them are not yet settled questions.
Alex, let me ask you a little more pointedly something that you've been referencing in this response and actually earlier in our conversation. Um, One could say that the set of developments and events that we've seen over the past month or so kind of got kicked off when Donald Trump sent a Truth Social post saying that help is on its way in response to the Iranian regime killing protesters. And the United States didn't do anything then because, in part, we just didn't have the assets in place, the capabilities to actually launch any military strikes against the country at that point. Since then, there's been this massive military buildup. It's still continuing. There's negotiations now, which, if they collapse, may lead to war, in fact. When Donald Trump first made that comment, back in early January, it kind of raised hopes of many people in Iran and in the diaspora that, in fact, the United States was going to launch some sort of either regime change operation or something to very actively help the protesters. Does the Iranian opposition today, as we're seeing some of these protests revitalize themselves, do they still believe this? Do they still see the United States military buildup in the Gulf? Do they see that as sort of coming to their salvation right now?
Look, there's a lot of hope invested in that for sure. Because, what is it that keeps the Islamic Republic in power? It's access to arms and its willingness to use those arms to stay in power. So if somebody, and it can be Iranians because they don't have access to arms, your average Iranian is not armed, with some minor exceptions of some ethnic groups on the periphery of the country. These protesters, and I know the Islamic Republic likes to call the protesters terrorists who are armed and came out, but I mean, there might have been a handful of members of or handful of protesters who were armed, but clearly vast majority of those protesters were not armed. So in that kind of a fight, the United States could give courage and certainly give the opposition in Iran, I should say, some hope. As I hear myself say this, I go back to something I mentioned earlier. It's a double-edged sword. The role of a foreign power in putting anybody else in place of Ali Khamenei, would it create long-term, legitimacy issues? Probably. And the other thing that I'm just thinking about is the United States can destroy a lot of targets inside of Iran that belong to the regime, its security forces, as I said earlier, Revolutionary Guards and so on. But is that in itself enough? Can you call that regime change? Because even if you take out their bases, these people have spent decades preparing for scenarios like this. I remember writing articles maybe 20 years ago about how mosques in Iran were oftentimes functioning as arms depots and so on. So, but nobody's talking about the United States sending soldiers into Iran to take over the place. So yes, you weaken the state, the Islamic Republic, but what else do you need for the political transition to happen? Unless, Khamenei and the Revolutionary Guards, the senior ones, are killed, the rest of them essentially give up or defect, then you still have a fight going on. And that's where maybe, I don't think the United States has thought this through. Others might have. But maybe there needs to be some kind of a provision of arms to the opposition side. And as I say this and listen to myself, I can see average Iranians going, no, that you're pointing to civil war. You're suggesting civil war. That's exactly what we're trying to avoid. We don't want to become Syria. And I'm not even sure if the United States is going to be willing to engage on that level. I could see President Trump basically, if not getting a quick win, a quick victory that can say, "This, I promise you, I'll never get us into anything that looks like the 2003 Iraq War." And I didn't, because look, we took out some sites and the people of Iran have taken over the country. If that doesn't happen, and the United States needs to commit to the opposition forces inside of Iran and diaspora winning, I just have a big question mark how much appetite this president would have for that kind of a campaign. And I think that it would be true for most Iranians, because the man's track record speaks for itself. He hasn't been willing so far, I might be wrong with Iran, but so far he hasn't been willing to show the patience and commitment to a project like this, which, by the way, politically has always been against. United States shouldn't be in the business of nation building. What is it? Our business. So this might just prove that he can take a different approach, but so far he hasn't. Let's wait and see what comes next.
An argument that many people have made is that one of the ways that we can help the Iranian people against the oppression of their regime is by creating these off-ramps for regime members willing to defect, sort of create fewer consequences for them to do so. But is this sort of a supply and demand problem? If we provide the supply, is there in fact a demand inside of the regime for those kinds of off-ramps? How unified is the regime exactly?
Well, my starting point, Matt, answering that question is a lot of people inside this regime know that it's totally disliked, and I'm being very mild in my description, disliked by the average population in Iran. So, they know that they have messed up, to be crude about it. They have their own records to point to where they have mishandled the economy. Corruption is rife, inflation, foreign policy is a disaster. It is. So a lot of these things are not just realities that opposition folks talk about. People inside the regime, on the rank and file, they accept them. So to your point about off-ramps, yeah, I think a lot of people inside the regime, the so-called technocratic class, the sort of people that show up in the morning at work and run the state machinery, make sure you got water, power, all the rest of it, they are probably going to seriously consider off-ramps if presented with those. And that's the smartest thing to do. That's not just something the Iranian diaspora opposition and the opposition inside of Iran that might show its face. We know it's there. The opposition in Iran is there for sure. And I'm not talking about protesters. I'm talking about dissent within the regime. They're there, but they need to be very careful in terms of what they're willing to say at this point. But at some point, they might emerge, and if you give them off ramps, that sort of emergence, if you will, from within might just happen faster. I don't think anybody seriously at this point, though, this is important, would want to see Ali Khamenei either killed or sidelined, and the regime sort of has a new leader at the top, but essentially stays the same. This is not going to do it. So the idea of the sort of Venezuela model or some other model where you have defection and then the regime continues, some people in the United States are writing about the Revolutionary Guards will take over. Well, it might take over, but that's no solution to the problems of the Iranian people, because the Revolutionary Guards has been in charge of Iran for 30 years now, with Khamenei hand in hand. So the country of Iran wants fundamental change. That's my reading of Iranian sentiment and anger that I'm measuring. They want fundamental change. They don't want some cosmetic Khamenei goes, but the Revolutionary Guards, they either take the uniforms up, put on some suits and tie, and then keep going running the place just on a different banner. And this is really important. It's the year 2026. It's exactly 125 years since the Iranian people first rose up in their first major attempt at a constitutional revolution back then, over a century ago. So this is a long fight that's been going on. I don't think it's going to go away. I doubt Khamenei is going to be willing to accommodate, to listen to people. And that's exactly why this crisis is so different. As again mentioned earlier, he's dealing with an extremely upset domestic front, and he now has the American military might at his doorsteps. And he, as of right now, seems to be putting his personal and his regime's pride above any kind of compromise that might just be enough for Donald Trump. And by the way, that's a really important point. How much pride here is a factor. Donald Trump's pride and Ali Khamenei's pride. And the consequences for the Iranian people, for the region, for the United States, we have to wait and see if things go south on that one.
Yeah, actually, very much on that note. In your latest article for the Middle East Institute, which we published on February 20th, you specifically write, quote, "The idea that Iran might offer deep concessions under the threat of force runs counter to the worldview of Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei and the security establishment." So is Trump's effort to force Iran into some sort of a deal through military strikes, is that in fact doomed to backfire?
You know, it might work, but it really comes down to what exactly he wants. On the enrichment nuclear issue, there's a deal to be had. There's a deal to be had. On the missiles and openly coming out and saying they capitulate, that's much harder. I would just say the following on the issue of Khamenei demand. Last time the regime had to make a big strategic decision, anything that's similar to this, was in 1988, summer of 1988, when they, after 8 years of fighting Saddam's Iraq and having said for years they would never compromise with him, they would never surrender or sign a peace deal with him, they decided in summer of 1988 to do so. Khamenei was president then. But here's the part that I think people should understand. Khamenei was not the one making the calls for that ceasefire with Saddam. It was Khomeini, his predecessor, the supreme leader, who was so old and essentially incapacitated that he let the other far more pragmatic figure in the regime, a man by the name of Ayatollah Rafsanjani, convinced the old man at the time to have this ceasefire deal with Saddam Hussein. My point of saying that is Rafsanjani was far more pragmatic and Khamenei is far more dogmatic. And Khamenei is already talking in terms of martyrdom. Khamenei's already, and I've been saying this for months, Khamenei is looking to death along the lines of what Hassan Nasrallah in Hezbollah faced in Beirut when Israel assassinated him with that massive bombing of his compound. Khamenei would rather have that sort of a departure from this earth than being the guy who agreed to Donald Trump's terms. Again, it's amazing to hear myself say this because he's one man's pride, and imagine the potential consequences if this conflict gets out of control. But yet here we are.
We're running short on time here, but before we wrap up, where do you see things going forward? What will you be watching to get a sense of how things might shape up?
Look, I think either way, the Islamic Republic is doomed. And not because of anything United States did or Israel, because the ruling elite in Tehran for so long have refused to read the writing on the wall, have refused to listen to their own people, have decided that these people don't matter, that they're not even Iranians, at least not good Iranians, not by their criteria. You cannot be 10, 15% of the population and forever keep the other 85%, maybe 90% hostage. Not when you have brought nothing but sanctions, isolation, misery. You just cannot stay on top of the power pyramid forever. So I have no doubt regime change is a question of time, and maybe how it manifests itself. When Ali Khamenei dies at age 86, that is the great opportunity for them to reinvent themselves if they want. But as we're discussing this, that opportunity might never happen in practice because the United States might intervene, and it would be too late for the regime to be able to reinvent itself, if you will, even if it could. And the big question then is, can the Iranians in Iran, much more importantly than diaspora, the Iranians in diaspora matter. They're significant. Some accounts talk about 8 million Iranians around the world. These are resourceful people and have strong views on the Islamic Republic and certainly should have a seat at the table. But fundamentally, the fight for the future of Iran is going to be led by Iranians in Iran. The Iranian opposition needs to help him from diaspora to the extent possible. But we shouldn't think this is going to be a cakewalk. This is going to be requiring a lot of organization, determination on the part of the opposition, on the part of the United States and others who care about Iran that stays intact, and hopefully an Iran that becomes one day soon, you would hope, certainly in my case, I hope, a sort of a secular, democratic Iran that is at peace at home and can be at peace with its neighbors, and certainly look at the United States, countries like Israel, very differently going forward in a constructive manner.
We'll have to leave things there for now, as that's all the time we've got for this week. But Alex, thank you very much for speaking with us again.
Thank you, Alistair and Matt. A pleasure speaking to you.
Just want to flag for our listeners that we will have links to both of the articles that we touched on in the episode show notes. A warm thanks also goes out to our listeners for tuning in, as well as to our production team for all of their work on this week's episode.
To find MEI's latest coverage of Iran, please visit our website, www.mei.edu. You can also follow MEI on X, Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube, and subscribe to our email newsletters for the latest analysis and information about upcoming events.
I'm Alistair Taylor.
And I'm Matthew Czekaj. We hope you listen in again next week.